Good. Hi, Jason. Nice to see you. Nice to meet you. I mean, we work with each other at GIPAM, so I know you. But today's purpose of our short video is to learn a bit more about what you are doing and what you would expect and what you would recommend for specific, let's say, market access and RWE cases. But before we go into that, maybe introduce yourself a bit, who you are, what your track record is, what you did beforehand before joining GIPAM. Yeah, just
Of course.
let us know. Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Jason Simeone. I'm located in the Boston area. I'm a pharmacoepidemiologist and really have specialized in real-world evidence generation, but also in certain market access activities and evidence synthesis work over my career. I've worked exclusively in consulting, but for a number of different organizations. Some were quite small, others were quite large, and I've worked with a large variety of pharma clients across many indications, and have worked on likely hundreds of studies in my career. So, as you mentioned before, we've worked together at a previous position, and really thrilled to have rebuilt a team of people who work together really well from a global perspective. So that's one of the things that really excites me about GPIM.
Thank you. Yeah, and I didn't introduce myself. My name is Thomas Wilkie, scientific lead of GIPAM. And Jason, I have a specific surprise.
Okay.
There are some pre-prepared questions, but I will draw them, and once the time is over, I will not ask more questions. So it's a bit random which questions I will ask, and let's see where the questions will in which direction they will lead us. So maybe I and there are some questions maybe also that are a bit personal. So I already excuse for that. Sorry for this, but maybe I go with the first question. That's a very general one, but maybe you can let us know your thoughts. I'm based in Europe, but you are based in Boston, and so market access in the US is one of your core topics. What are typically the main steps to get market access in the US?
Yeah, this is a really great question, and it's a really complex one, I think, coming from the EU to the US perspective, because the US market is really complex and it's quite different. So there's really no unified HTA body like you have in Europe. Rather, the stakeholders here include payers or controllers of payers. So these are the people who the payers assign to make their decisions for their formularies. That might be a PBM. It also includes the physicians who are prescribing the products, and most importantly, it includes the patients. So there's actually direct-to-consumer advertising here in the US. And so a successful product needs to have a value proposition that fits all three of those stakeholders. So what does a company need to do? First, they really need to deeply understand their market, and RWE and other activities can play a role there. So we start typically by encouraging sponsors as early as possible to start thinking about epi and natural history studies and understanding the burden of illness, and really trying to understand what are the unmet needs that are in an indication of interest based on the current treatment landscape. So a sponsor company really has to deeply understand this area before they can start moving into building their own value proposition. So once they know unmet needs, they can start to place their own asset within that treatment landscape and start highlighting areas where they might want to focus. And so that could include the target patient population, maybe some benefits to their treatment. Maybe it's an oral therapy and the existing therapies require infusion. Maybe there's, from a patient perspective, a more beneficial dosing. Maybe it's once per day instead of a multi-day, multiple times per day regimen. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. In the U.S. also, of course, pricing is a big component of the market access role. And so pricing and reimbursement, this is where sponsors are going to be preparing these packages and hopefully pricing their product in a way that makes sense. So that might include value-based pricing, or pay-for-performance type of contracts are becoming increasingly popular. We can support with that type of work as in addition to the other types of studies that we mentioned earlier. And then the role moves to really getting access to their product across payers within the U.S. And as I mentioned, there's many thousands of payers in the U.S., and they're quite diverse, from the states themselves who manage Medicaid programs to other payers, commercial payers that might sponsor employee-based plans, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I can confirm if as a European, and I'm based in Germany, if you travel to the US and turn on the TV, you are really surprised about the direct advertising for RX drugs, which is something that is forbidden in Germany. Yeah. And that's interesting.
Unique.
Yeah, it is. Let me have a look at the next question, Jason. I put that in front of me now.
Keep things interesting.
Yeah, maybe you touched already on that a bit, but maybe to be a bit more specific. In market access, and let's stay in the US. Where do evidence synthesis and RWE might play a role? So real-world evidence. And what is their role then?
So actually, they complement each other quite well. So early in a development life cycle, we often recommend that a sponsor, if they're trying to do just internal research, that a targeted literature review to understand what's already been published is really valuable. There are likely going to be gaps found after conducting those literature reviews. And in those cases, RWE is really a useful tool in the toolbox to employ to generate that custom evidence that a sponsor might need to complete their market access strategy. So, you could imagine that after conducting a literature review, maybe we identify epi estimates for a disease. We understand a bit about burden of illness, but maybe some of that work is really out of date and it doesn't reflect the current treatment landscape. So it might be necessary then to conduct an RWE study to bring some really current evidence into the literature. So those are, I would say, the ways that evidence synthesis work and RWE can work in tandem or subsequent to each other. They're really complementary, and both, I think, need to be part of a study sponsor's toolkit.
Mm-hmm. And is it right to assume that 80-90% of RWE in the US are database studies?
I would say it is likely the majority, yes. But there's also quite a bit of survey work done and work done.
Okay.
Yeah. And that might include surveys done at physician offices, or increasingly, sponsors are being asked to provide evidence that is relevant for patients. Mm-hmm. So they want to understand patient-reported outcome data, and that type of data are not reported in secondary claims databases or even mostly EHR databases, as you know. So that can be a typical gap from secondary data sources, and then oftentimes we need to go directly to patients to understand what that burden is on themselves, and that helps a sponsor shape their value proposition for patients.
Okay, so let's look for the next one. I have a couple of. I want you. I want you. There might be some let's say, more leisurely questions around your private preferences. Here's a question: in your hometown, what is the greatest thing you can do in your hometown?
Oh, so I
Which is
live
Boston, right?
in okay, well let's expand it to Boston, because I live in a small town that's
let's
it's
expand to
lovely
Boston.
place to spend an afternoon, but it's not as exciting as Boston.
And don't say staying in a hotel, because I did that and it's very expensive. So that it might be great experience, but it's very expensive.
Yeah. So maybe one thing that I would recommend, if you're visiting Boston for the first time and you want to get a nice tour of Boston, there's something it's not unique to Boston, but it maybe started here, I think, are these vehicles called duck boats, and they're adapted from World War II, actually, amphibious vehicles that they used in World War II. And so they start on the streets, and you can pick a part of Boston to tour, and then they also go into the water. So that's fun. And so, yeah, you'll start, it's a boat-shaped vehicle, and the sides are open, and so the tour operator will show you all the interesting spots of Boston, which was founded back in the 1620s. So it's, for the US, an older city, and it was built before cars, and it has a maybe European feel in sections to it. And there's nice parks, and there's a river, the Charles River, that separates Boston from Cambridge. And so a duck boat is a nice way to explore the city, and from the road and from the water.
That's great. I need to do that. I never did that, so that's good. So the next question, sorry, are we going back to our topic? That is a bit around one type of RWE studies, which is database studies. The question is how to select the right database, and what does it cost to do such a selection in terms of time and money?
Yeah. So this is actually a really important topic. It's one I'm glad you're raising. This type of work, it depends, I think, on what a sponsor is trying to do. So if they just need to conduct some research internally, we can often guide them towards the correct database or a useful database for free. We provide consulting services around what type of data should be used. So for example, if we need to generate cost data, we're going to be using claims data, which is where cost data are recorded. We can link databases together. So for example, if we need cost data from claims, we may recommend linking to an electronic medical record database. If there's clinical information that's only captured in the EHRs, we can also survey different database vendors and get an idea of patient counts. We can typically do that for free. But in other use cases, we may need to conduct a more rigorous feasibility and landscaping exercise. That can often take a number of weeks. Why does it take that? Because to get really clear information on what is contained in a database and limitations and access, we have to outreach to the different vendors, and we ask them to complete a standardized questionnaire. So some of that time really is just dependent on waiting for the responses from the vendors. So it's a bit of a pro and con between shortening that period, in which case you're risking not getting complete information from different vendors, or making it too lengthy of a process. I would say one use case where a database feasibility study is really useful is if they were conducting an external or synthetic control arm study. In those cases, agencies really want to understand why you selected a database. Is it fit for purpose? And why did you reject other potential data sources as options? And in those cases, budget's really not a consideration that they would consider as being a part of the rationale for making that strategic decision. And another use case would be like a post-authorization safety study. So in general, if a study is intended for regulatory purposes, a really rigorous feasibility assessment can be very useful.
Yeah, and from a European perspective, I think we also go in that direction, that more and more we need to justify why did we use that or that database. I mean, in the past, it was more like we were happy like hell if we found any database for,
That's right.
because not that many data were available. But that's improving, and that means showing transparently which database has been selected and why is a value. Yeah, no, that's good. We are running a bit out of time. I would say let's select the last question, if you agree, Jason. I hope it's a question that's not too too personal. No, it's not. It's, I think partly you answered that already. But if I'm a company running a single arm trial, let's say in oncology, and now feel, and my regulatory and HTA buddies, at least in Europe, tell me comparator data would be nice, and I'm thinking about a synthetic control group. If you would plan such a synthetic control group, let's say in the US, what would you recommend? How to do that, and how much time in advance would you plan to prepare for that type of exercise?
Yeah, this is important. So external control arm comparisons are increasingly being used because single arm trials are increasingly being conducted, and there's a lot of good reasons for that. We recommend that sponsors start preparing for an external comparator study during the design phase of their trial. So before outcomes are already being generated, before you have results, you should be thinking about your external comparator arm. And why is that important? Oftentimes, the selection criteria for your trial might include criteria that are really difficult to identify in real-world databases. And one of the key things that a sponsor needs to keep in mind is these two arms have to be comparable. And so that can present challenges. And also the outcomes need to be identifiable in real-world data. That might require something like clinical adjudication of outcomes if we think that there's maybe the potential for misclassification when we're using diagnosis codes to identify outcomes in an electronic medical records database, for example. So I touched on really the importance of conducting database feasibility work, because we want to know, can we identify comparable patients? Do we have enough patients? And often sample size can be a concern. And we have to keep in mind that even if there are potentially enough patients with a certain diagnosis in a database, once we start applying all of those criteria that were in your trial, sample size will decrease. And so we want to make sure there's enough patients to conduct that comparator arm. And then understanding missingness around key covariates. So there could be confounding variables that affect the analysis and could introduce bias, as well as capture of outcomes. And so we want to think about the design of this external comparator arm. So again, as early as we can start doing that is really important for a study sponsor.
Mm-hmm. And you said early, I'm planning now a phase 3 trial single arm. Mm-hmm. When would you start thinking and planning the synthetic control group?
Let's start now. Yeah. Let's start now, because again, that database feasibility work will take time, and we'll develop, we'll select the database, we'll contract the database, and start study design. And let's do that in parallel to the design of your trial, because what we have in real world data and what we're able to identify might actually inform your trial design in some cases. So you may need to consider some alterations in your trial design, as long as we're starting early enough. It also could be really useful to understand what's already been done, what has been submitted, say, to FDA, or what's been published as previous external comparators. Then we can understand potentially agency criticisms and incorporate those in the design of our study. That can be very useful.
No, many thanks. That's all we have time for today, I would say, to prove. I have some more questions, but I didn't ask them today. So that means we need to repeat that. But many thanks, Jason, for these interesting insights. And I think a lot can be done. And in that sense, looking forward to the next projects and the next insights coming from your team. Thank you.
I am too. Thanks. Thank you, Tom.